Yes, welcome. This is F a Rap Critic. I'm your boy Malik 16. Yes, my hat is blocking the name of the show, but no, there's no connection or relation to Black Santa Claus. I give you the gift of gab, but this is me just trying to blend a few things and also trying to go with the album title and make a big deal of the fact that this is the final round in a series of albums that I told you from the beginning of the fall that I would be bringing to the conversation about their classic status so we can all determine it together. This album is no exception. We are talking about The Red Light District by Ludacris. Now it all starts to make sense. You see, Red Light District, the color red. I want to take a minute to send an early birthday shout out by the time this video is released to the creator and founder of the brand that I'm wearing, the one and only April Walker. Shout out to you, tying it all together. All right, this is category 1. We go over the album, the product itself. If you have not already, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. And while you're at it, tell a friend to tell a friend and go check out the Rap Ruler as well. A little background about this album. It was released on December 7th of 2004. This was under the Def Jam imprint, of course, in partnership with Ludacris's own Disturbing the Peace Records. And it is the 4th album under that deal, but Ludacris's 5th album as a soloist overall. And we'll jump into it. The first dimension of category 1 is Dimension 1. Quality of the production. Ludacris gathered a nice batch of producers who were either making a name or weren't very known on a mainstream level and mixed them, of course, with some of the heavier hitters of the time. So if we're talking about the 2004 landscape, you're going to see names here that were either on the verge of having a run with things or in the middle of having a run with things. So producers like Polo the Don, who was in the middle of a very grand highlight, the high point of his production career, and Needles, who was on the come up, and you would hear his name sprinkled prominently throughout the next 2 or so years, and then Salam Remy, who was experiencing a resurgence. But then you also had some in-house producers like LT Mo and Ice Drake, who did Splash Waterfalls on the previous album, and it's also, fun fact, Shauna's brother. So you have them. And then you have, of course, bigger names like Timbaland. And then you have some surprise production from the likes of people like DJ Green Lantern. Green Lantern, who knew? What he contributed to Ludacris here, number 1 spot, being the biggest production credit that he's ever gotten. Another surprise is DJ Toomp, who, this is an interesting point in Ludacris's career, who he's actively beefing with T.I., and for some reason on this album, he kind of takes a pause from it, because on the previous album, he had Blow It Out. We've talked about it in other episodes where that video was geared all towards T.I. The talking in between. That song was a sub to T.I. And then on the album that follows this, you have War with God, where he's not letting up. So for DJ Toomp, who played a pivotal role in T.I.'s blow up the year before, it's interesting. I wonder how long he was sitting on this beat, or if he just played the Switzerland neutral role and like, hey, a beat sale is a beat sale. And then Luda, always being a loyalist to the South, makes sure that he picks up production from some of the OGs in the game. So there's a producer, TikTok, who collaborates with the Medicine Men, formerly known as Beats by the Pound from the No Limit camp. They contribute a beat on here, as well as Organized Noise. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. And then there's some names that just never really circulated too much into the mainstream past this point to become household, like DK All Day, Heezy, Voodoo, and Craig King. But just want to highlight that. Not lean too heavily on samples means that you're playing with a wide sound bed here. So as far as the samples that do get used, most notably the Austin Powers series, which made this song Soul Bossa Nova by Quincy Jones, rest in peace, kind of iconic, more iconic than I think it has ever been on its own, where it was reintroduced to a whole new generation and is now forever kind of synonymous with that film, and no one at the time was thinking to sample it for rap. Shout out to DJ Green Lantern. He had the foresight to say somebody should do something with this, and then Ludacris at the time, being the kind of figure he is in hip hop, wound up being the perfect person to knock that out of the park. And it's the early makings. It has all of the makings of a trap beat, which it probably will never get its credit for being because of how happy the instrumentation is and what it's associated with. But for all intents and purposes, bassline and drum pattern screams trap, more so than the DJ Toomp offering, which samples Ghetto Child or Lil Child Running Wild from the Superfly soundtrack by Curtis Mayfield. And it's a more mellow beat for Toomp, because Toomp is better known for making these like big southern anthemic soulful type songs with the trap drums behind it, and this was more a slowed down cruising kind of song, and you know, that's the purpose that it was supposed to serve. But it's interesting, you would think that something would be reversed as far as who it's credited to for the use of samples there. We also get Child of the Night, which, similar to Number One Spot, is able to capture a southern and trap kind of feel, high energy, even though it samples a ballad, a Tina Marie ballad from the 1980s, Portuguese Love. But it keeps this excitement and this nighttime feel of it. So not nighttime as in Quiet Storm like the original was going, but the fact that it's able to manipulate that sample and make something that, I guess, more crunk than trap. It just fit Luda's style with the hard hits and build-ups. Probably the most interesting sample on here is the song that's taken from the movie Oliver, which is based on the Charles Dickens novel. And even the song title is interesting. It's called Pick a Pocket or Two. And it perfectly pertains to what Ludacris wound up doing with the point of the song, Large Amounts. But shout out to Voodoo for even thinking a sample from that, because it has this cartoonish feel, but this sinister feel and this slinky kind of beat, because it's from this movie that's musical. And so whenever you're sampling a musical, it's going to have some campy element to it. And it worked perfectly for the feel that was trying to be induced here. So really inventive uses of sampling all throughout this album. Unexpected, not just lazy beat jacking, but really taking elements and playing around with them. Beyond that, there are some experimental beats that take us new places. I think what Organized Noise did with Blueberry Yum Yum was different for them. It's not out of their wheelhouse, because as we get into that iteration of the Dungeon Family, they started playing with new things anyway. You saw that they were going in these expansive directions. And this is honestly more stripped down and creepy, but Organized Noise has always been a crew that has a limitless range. Every 4 years, they're coming with something new. So when you saw that it's produced by them, it's not surprising, but you also can acknowledge that it is different for them. There's a dated quality to it. Same can be said for the Medicine Men offering. Unfortunately, the OG producers kind of gave some beats that sounded like they would have been better suited 2 years prior, maybe 5 years prior. Get Back, as popular as it is of a song, it really sounded super commercial. And maybe we were in the timing for that, because when I first heard In the Club by 50 Cent, I thought those horn hits sounded like an actual commercial, like a rap song that you would hear for a commercial. I'm like, there's not many songs that use these kind of like grand horn hits. And Get Back sounded so popish and so in the pocket for what you expect to hear from Ludacris, that it sounded 2 years old. It sounded like something for the Fast and Furious soundtrack. Now, he had a song a year before, Act the Fool, for Fast and Furious 2, and you could switch them and it would have worked. It reminded me of Shake Your Tail Feather by Nelly, which was made for the Bad Boy soundtrack. Just very, very pop rap commercial sounding, even though it's high energy. Put Your Money Up by Ice Drake It also sounded a little dated. It contained a sound that was really popular at one point in year in hip hop, and I think it was like 99 going into 2000. It kind of reminds me of the song Tommy's Theme. And for a while, they were using it as the main theme for the Source Awards. This, of course, is when Benzino was like running everything at the Source behind the curtain and not so behind the curtain. It sounded like that era. So the only folly with those beats, they're good beats, but they sounded for a 2004 album a little past their time. We never know how long rappers are sitting on beats or sitting on songs and decide to place them. Politics happen, whatever the case, or you just love the song so much, it's like, now I gotta use it. These didn't affect the popularity or the impact. We'll talk about that, but they do have a dated quality to them. Who Not Me sounds like a Ludacris album track the same way that Get Back sounds like a Ludacris single. It reminds me of what Eminem was doing his formulaic structure for his album releases, where he always had the one cartoony lead single, and then, you know, you'll get the dark Eminem production on the album. So where it gets experimental and you get some new sounds and things that you aren't used to hearing are beats like Pass Out, which so simple, still has that traditional Luda feel, some of those trap and crunk elements, but it's such a stripped down basic beat that it relies on how the bass pumps and the type of instrumentation. Needles became popular for using very futuristic kind of video game sounds, and this is no exception. That distorted, that adds a texture and accent to this booming bass that hypes the song up. I could say the same about Timbaland's offering. So Timbaland's intro, as basic as it is probably one of the most undeniable hip-hop beats he's made. Timbaland has always dabbled in pop, R&B, rap spaces, but, you know, it took him a long time to get like just pure hip-hop credit. It depended on who started, you know, rapping on his beats that would give him the thumbs up from, again, that hip-hop purist crowd. He could be making the illest beat and you're like, oh, that's cool, you know, for that kind of music that they make. But it's like, oh, okay, this was just undeniable boom bap. That guitar strum with that bass line is just incessant, that boom, 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 boom. And it builds anticipation. It feels like an intro. It's hip-hop. Now, what he does on The Potion, which is experimental, he's using these animal sounds with these swinging conga type drums that are just all over the place. If you watch the Black Album documentary by Jay-Z, the movie Fade to Black, it shows Timbaland his own excitement at the beat that he created, because this wound up being one of the beats that he was trying to offer Jay-Z as he was constructing the Black Album. Jay-Z passed on it, but you could see in that interaction, Jay-Z's nodding his head because he's feeling it. Timbaland starts making these like ape or gorilla gestures because that's what the beat is conjuring, right? So it feels very jungle-ish. As history would have it, it seems Luda was the perfect person for this beat. I can't imagine too many other rappers of the time being able to freak it the way he did. And on that same note, can't not mention the song Virgo, where even though it's credited to Salaam Remi, we got to credit Harlem's own Dougie Fresh for really providing that audio backdrop of beatbox, because that's essentially the whole track is Dougie, world's greatest entertainer that he is, giving him this just straight rhythm to rap over, something new and different for that generation of hip-hop. When's the last time you heard beatbox, right? I think the last person who tried it before them was Heavy D with Waterbed Hev having beatboxing on his album, and Timbaland always trying to incorporate it. So speaking of Timbaland, and I guess that could be something that characterizes the production on this album, is that you're getting sounds and styles from folks who you didn't expect to give you that sound, when the folks who you did expect to give you that sound are on the album but didn't do that. So the same way I described that dynamic with the Toonk beat compared to the Green Lantern beat, it's the same thing that happens by just having DJ Quick on a song like Spur of the Moment, but he didn't produce it. It's LT Mo who produces it, and it sounds just like something that Quick himself would create. It has that same West Coast feel. It has the modulated synthesizer. It has the funk bass line. Even the singing on it sounds like a quick single. So it sounds like one of those situations was like, this beat captures the feeling that I want, but there ain't no way. This beat is so similar to what Quick would do. Ain't no way I can't have Quick on it. That would be the only logical explanation, because there's no way I'm getting DJ Quick to come in and let somebody else make another beat that sounds like a beat that he would have made when I could have just had him. Unless I just can't afford both. It's like, oh, you got to pick a verse or the track. But it winds up fitting like perfectly. And so, yeah, same way we're talking about Salaam Remi having the beatbox beat when that's Timbaland's thing, and Timbaland's on this album not doing beatbox. Yeah, very cool that the album begins with something that's undeniably a hip-hop boom bap sound and ends with something that's undeniably hip-hop boom bap, but from one of the lost elements of hip-hop. And very unexpected for Ludacris. So you're running the gamut here. You get familiar, you get experimental, you get legendary names, you get new names. And that's the scope of your production on this album. How good that all sounds to you, something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 2, the cohesiveness of that sonic bed, all right? So how does it all flow together? Well, not surprisingly, because this is a matter of sequence, Ludacris being a businessman, I imagine that Luda's very hands-on with the construction of the album from beginning to end. And so when you think about how I talked about in the last dimension, that very hip-hop beginning, very hip-hop end, and then in between you're getting everything else, right? So you're making sure that you have enough of what Ludacris fans came for, but as he said on the potion, he's trying to give you something different, speaking about what hip-hop is missing. And so keeping that characterization in mind of what I said about the different producers doing things that the other producers would do, it seems like even though there's a hodgepodge of producers, it all winds up working well, because whatever one producer didn't give, another producer gave to make up for that. And what the producer you had expectations for gave, he's giving you something new and different. And so singles wise, they're not all together, they're spaced out. I'm a big fan of when albums don't cluster all the singles in the same area of the album, especially not all in the beginning, and then you're left with a bunch of album tracks. So Pimpin' All Over the World is one of the last songs, and Number One Spot and Get Back are some of the first songs, and in between you get some of those B-side singles. Same goes for pacing. For every lighter song, like a spur of the moment that's right in between, the more aggressive songs like Who Not Me and Pass Out, or serious songs. So if it's Large Amounts followed by Pimpin' All Over the World, and then Hopeless with a splash of experimental. So the ratio is kind of like upbeat, little bit more mellow, experimental, and it keeps it where some of those songs don't become throw-offs. I also think if you would have placed the experimental songs too close next to each other or all in sequence of each other, it would have been like, oh, what's this? I don't come to a Ludacris album for that. And if you would have placed those familiar sounding Ludacris songs too close to each other, it would have been like, here we go again. It sounds like the last album. You're not really getting that here, but that is something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 3, the intentional mood and tone of the album. Okay, this is a significant period in Ludacris's career. Again, his 4th album on Def Jam, his 5th as a soloist. His first hurdle was being taken seriously as a rapper, moving away from his radio personality and first career as this audio character, right? Chris Lover Lover. Now you know him as Ludacris, especially outside of the South. Shoot, at this point, we've now seen him acting in serious movie roles. But he started doing articles around this time stating that he feels like he's not given enough due and credit in the hip hop circle, similar to what I was saying in the beginning of this episode. When the top 5 conversations come up, he's not mentioned. When the top 10 conversations come up, he's not mentioned. In the sales conversation and in, again, a mainstream presence, yes, he's there. But Luda wanted that rap respect, and it wasn't as loud as it became on the next 2 albums that followed, but this was the beginning of him wanting that. So that intro and that outro speak to that, and songs like The Potion, and the fact that The Potion was pushed to become a single. Also, I mean, shoot, if you're spending Timberland money, you better put that as a single, right? But there's an underlying tone of that. The other is a maturation. It's not, again, as obvious as on the next 2 albums that follow, but Luda is also grown. And part of why I even brought this album to the classic conversation is because I feel like this is the most organic maturation we've seen in Ludacris's career, whereas the other 2 albums seemed a little pushed, like, I'm going for this maturity role. Here, this is just him naturally coming to this space. He's like, hey, I'm 4 albums in, I've had super success every time I've released. What am I doing now at this point in my career? Also, as a man, bigger things going on. I got business ventures. I've tasted Hollywood money now. I've put out successful artists. I'm in a different space. I'm only proving something to myself. And it's like he just kind of got there. Doing a song like Large Amounts didn't sound contrived. It sounded like it really came from a place of where he's at now, and he's looking around and he's like, oh yeah. When you watch or see the commentary and DVD that corresponds with this album, Ludacris is way better exacting and articulating his points through rhymes than he is through speaking, because at the end of the documentary he's like, oh, I named the album The Red Light District because each one of us has our own red light district. We all do a little wrong. It's just about what you learn from it. And you can tell he's still a little bitter and still kind of licking his wounds from the fallout and drama created by Bill O'Reilly, who caused him to lose a Pepsi endorsement, which he addressed on the previous album, but continues to address here with lines like, respected highly, hi, Mr. O'Reilly, hope all is well, kiss the plaintiff and the wifey. Like, it's a very perfectly timed, tongue-in-cheek, got my lick back kind of line, but it also shows that still did some damage to Luda's career, or an opportunity that would have gave him even more money. And again, as a businessman, that matters. And if you care about your rap image, that matters too. But Luda also being this symbol of that and all things hood, and waving the flag for all things hood, he also has to double down on his stance, right? I'm from the hood, I like smoking, and just because I smoke shouldn't be da-da-da-da-da. And, he's trying to justify regular rapper rationalizations, but it doesn't come off as well as the points he makes in the actual songs on the album. Now, give or take, he might have been high when he did the DVD and commentary. Most of the DVD, he is high. So, ain't gonna be his best representation. Nothing on this album really screams Red Light District. I think it just sounded like a cool, witty, fashionable title at the time. Red Light District was becoming all the rage for Black Americans in the know. I think white Americans have been traveling there for a long time prior. But for a hip-hop generation, this was a new destination now. And so it's like, oh, Luda's like, oh, I'm the first to really capitalize off the popularity of it. Let me make this a thing. Let me present this access to those who don't have access. And then let me try to stretch the metaphor. Because the album is more insightful than that. There's only one song where he's talking about illicit activity of any kind, really. Little mention here, but this is more about property ownership and what to do when you reach a certain point of wealth, and what you're still dealing with even when you're reaching that point. When you hear a song like Pimpin' All Over the World, he's speaking about the beauty and grandeur of having that kind of access to travel the world, and almost in a way of like, you should do it too. You should get like me and be able to do it, not so much dangling it in your face. 2 Miles an Hour is more of that kind of song, but it's just so focused. There's a lot of splurging and responsibility dynamic when it comes to money and access all throughout this album. From Put Your Money to Large Amounts to 2 Miles an Hour to Pimping All Over the World to number one spot. It's just, that is more of a focal point and marker of where Ludacris is at in his career and as a person than anything else. And I think that's more of the prominent thing going on here. There's always an element of fun when it comes to Ludacris. But yeah, the secondary being, hey, I can spit, y'all. And you may not realize it now, but I can spit. But y'all tell me if y'all pick up on anything that I didn't and anything that I neglected to mention. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 4, the song distinction versus the repetition of words and sounds. I'm going to jump out the gate and say that there's very, very little redundancy on here due to the fact that you only get one repeat production showing here, and that's from Timbaland. Timbaland's the only producer on here to contribute more than one track. So the room for repetition or redundancy is very low because you're getting all of these different sounds from these different spaces. The most similar thing here being like big bass, big booming bass, which you come to expect from Ludacris, but none of it is done the same way. So that takes us to words, and Ludacris is not running out of words because he's not running out of subject matter, nor is he running out of ways to say these things. So you'll be hard pressed to find anything repeated. There's very little intentional branding as well, because again, he's so deep into his career at this point. There's not much more to brand and remind you of. He's not yelling DTP throughout this album. He's not yelling ATL in Georgia as much as he usually would. He's got nothing to really prove on those fronts. And so the intentional branding is more subtle. He's naming his business partner. He's saying, me and Shaka are starving and still hungry for meals. Yeah, so not a lot of repetition at all from words or sounds. And that is something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats if you pick up on anything different. Takes us to dimension 5, the amount of content versus the amount of songs. All right, there are 16 tracks on this album, 15 if we exclude the one skit where there's the phone call, the obligatory skit where there's the jealous boyfriend phone call. Since Ludacris naturally incorporates humor in most of his projects, there's an element of comic view style comedy, I'd say, right? I think black comedy that was okay at the time that may not fly now. If Ludacris was as high profile of a rapper now as he was then, this skit would have got him in trouble for the domestic violence implications where the guy's like, oh, it's Luda? Oh, pick yourself off the floor, baby. I'm sorry, I didn't know. But back then, this is knee-slapping nigga comedy right here. Oh, snap. You know, he went from being jealous to being a male groupie. Even though Ludacris smoothly dodges the bullet of making that skit sound cool because he hangs up, he's like, I gotta go. But the fact that it's his album and he put the skit on there, that's where this generation would probably call this out. I digress. Sometimes when I call out what this generation would call out, I feel just as guilty for contributing to the problem. So a lot of times I like to keep my mouth shut. But, you know, as someone who's a hip hop historian guiding you through these albums, sometimes I feel like I have to shed light on those things. It's a weird space to exist in. But yeah, 15 songs, which is just stretching the limits of where the standard rap classics exist, because the intro is not a full song, so it's more like a 14-track album in a way. It still captures that conciseness, that concision of a standard classic album within that range. And anything beyond that, I think Luda would have really, really started risking sounding like some of his other albums that were too big for their own good. And on this album, you probably get the best ratio of topics of any Ludacris album. Another reason why I put this up for the conversation on this episode. For every hype, crunk, aggressive song that Luda has on here, he has a more thoughtful, reflective, mellowed out song where he's talking about a different aspect of life. And his life, but also life in a way where he's talking it where it pertains to, he puts himself in the picture and then he talks to you and puts you in the picture. And so on the deeper side, you have Child of the Night, you have Large Amounts, you have Hopeless. And on the less deep side, in the middle, you just have topical things. Pimping All Over the World, 2 Miles an Hour, Put Your Money Up. All these things are very focused. Even Virgo, to an extent, is focused. And then within the braggadocio songs, they all have their own shades and tones of a specific thing he's focusing on, which is helped by other things that he does on the mic with it. But Luda is not expected to give you this, and so he exceeds expectations with these kind of ratios, and he continues to try to focus his albums like that for the rest of his career. But yeah, out of 15 tracks, you're getting 3 thought-provoking songs, which is new territory for Ludacris, especially since the album before that only had 1, and it was very light, very surface level. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to Dimension 6, the features. Okay, I mentioned in Dimension 4 that there isn't a lot of intentional branding of the DTP label. And with that comes into consideration the idea that there are no DTP features on this album except for the new acts that he is trying to introduce. So on the beginning of Who Not Me, Ludacris says, introducing the newest members of DTP, Dollar Boy and Small World, who are members of groups respectively, right? So you're talking about North Click, which is a group that really never came into fruition into the mainstream with any releases, and in Play a Circle, which is the group consisting of Dollar Boy and, at the time, Titty Boy, who came to be known as 2 Chainz to the world at large. But Titty Boy was a long-standing member of DTP who played the background for a while before finally breaking out in the duo Play a Circle, and this was priming all of that. And then, of course, you have Bobby Valentino, who had become a breakout star around this same time. And so DTP was in a really, really interesting space. They had just acquired and released Chingy, and he blew up out of nowhere and took precedence and prominence over a lot of those longtime members like Titty Boy, who had loyally played their role. Shawnna had just released a solo album. I-20 was beginning to feature on other people's music, and they had just acquired Field Mob and folded them into the camp. And so around this same time, DTP was starting to dabble into the mixtape trend that had taken over the game. And so I think the focus became that DTP was going to be represented in the form of compilations and these other projects that introduced the whole crew, instead of having them only relegated to Ludacris albums like on his prior releases. But I also do think, again, part of that maturation is a sign of the times. This is the last Ludacris album where you are seeing a DTP presence like that. It really became mostly about the man himself, Ludacris the soloist, and the other industry luminaries and features he could get, than having Lil Fate, Shawnna, I-20, and Titty Boy on songs. And, you know, depending on how you view it, you might consider it him shaking off some dead weight. 2 of those rappers never really arrived at any space. And after this point, Shawnna can say that she had a hit or 2. It took Titty Boy a whole reimagining and period of laying low and having to rebrand himself as 2 Chainz to blow up without any DTP connections. Most people didn't even realize and don't realize that this is the same person from back then. I think around this time also Chingy had split very quickly from DTP and made some claims of not getting his money. Field Mob quickly wound up in the same basket as Chingy with some gripes about the label. So it was probably in Luda's best interest to focus on self. And the features from DTP here, the fact that it's just a sprinkle, you could argue that they have either no effect or some effect. Pimpin' All Over the World could have been just as catchy with any singer, but good thing it was Bobby Valentino. He fit right in pocket. He was having his moment, and it worked well. As far as Who Not Me, I initially slept on the first verse by Small World. Small World, shout out to you. Small World, in my opinion, has a very outstanding verse on his song, whereas Dollar Boy, I mean, if you're a fan of the traditional, reason that Southern hip hop is so popular is because you don't have to rewind it. It is so easy to listen to and sing along to. Dollar Boy feels that. He almost comes off like a Birdman. As far as the features outside of DTP, you have DMX, who I would love to hear the backstory. I feel like I've heard one version of this where it was like unfinished, so Ludacris just used what he could get. He only had this hook. One of the only hooks where the rapper goes back and forth with DMX. You don't hear DMX trading bars often, but they really collaborate on that hook. It's better 100, better stat. He's adding his own ad-libs in between, and it's really coming off as this contrast between those two styles. And it's a collab you didn't think that you needed, but it's the ultimate Def Jam collab at the time. They're two of the biggest Def Jam stars when we're talking about a year like 2004, but this was also a huge turning point in DMX's career and how he was seen publicly, because this is when he started to have back-to-back run-ins with the law, and he was more known for that than hits at the time. So this is another, just like the beat aspect of that song sounding a little too late for its time. Like, this would have been a banger on the Word of Mouth album. It would have been a mega hit, but it just seemed a little too late. And the fact that DMX doesn't get a verse, which would have added a much needed switch up from 3 whole verses of Luda over that beat. It would have been nice to hear DMX rip, but he's on there. You also have Sleepy Brown on the hook for Blueberry Yum Yum. And fun fact, when we're talking about that song, Future is credited by his government name, which I won't dare try to pronounce here. I know some people be saying it rolls off the tongue because you've known him, he's been in your lives forever, but nah. A very young Future, when he was still, considered a part of the second generation of the Dungeon family, is credited, and it's come out that he actually wrote the hook here. So this is very early patterns of Future's rhythmic style and being able to make catchy melodic stuff, and it shows. And shout out to Luda for being big enough to give him that credit and take the suggestion. I imagine it came as a package deal. Rico Wade, Ray Murray, and Sleepy Brown are credited on this. Organized Noise usually worked as a team down to the bass player that they hired, and they probably were all in the lab cooking together, probably smoking, and came up with that. And down to the ad-libs that Sleepy Brown is providing. He's not just singing the hook. In the background, he's going la 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 as Ludacris is doing his melodic cadence, which Ludacris gives you a disclaimer in the beginning, like, I'm gonna try something new, I don't really sing. And if you watch the DVD, he repeats that disclaimer. You can tell there's some insecurity around it. And I don't know if I would call what Luda is doing on here singing, especially in this postmodern era of hip hop where we've seen where rappers took it. We thought 50 and Ja Rule were bending the rules a little bit. They had no idea what was up ahead with the world after 808s and Heartbreaks and Drake came, where there's actual crooning going on by rappers. So very interesting that Ludacris felt the need to put that there. But you have that. You also have Trick Daddy, which is a very 2004 feature. At the time, Trick Daddy was considered one of the go-tos from the South if you were going to get a rapper. I don't know how it seemed Rick Ross came and took his spot. But Trick Daddy was the go-to Florida rapper at the time. They gave you kind of a street stamp, a soulful Southern, and heartfelt stamp on, and hits as well. Trick Daddy is now just known as like a reality star or a dude with a cooking show, or a dude that does songs with Trina, by a whole generation that don't understand how pivotal this man was. Yeah. As I mentioned, you also have DJ Quick, another example of a rapper that we don't hear going back and forth often with a lot of outside rappers. And him and Luda go 4 for 4, 8 for 8. And it's just a thing to behold on that song. So shout out to Luda for being able to get these rappers in different spaces. Then, of course, you have Dougie Fresh and Nas on Virgo, which sounds like, okay, a return of the favor from Ludacris's iconic appearance on the Made You Look remix the year before. And it's like, okay, well, why don't we do a joint together? And this wound up being used for Nas's double album, Street's Disciple, as well as this album. So I don't know whose song it originally was, but it seemed like, hey, let's work together again since that went so well. Unexpected both times. No one thought of this collab, and those tend to be some of the best collabs, similar to all of the outside collabs on here. Honestly, Ludacris and Organized Noise, not their first time working together, but Ludacris and Sleepy Brown, nice contrast. Ludacris and DMX, nice contrast. Ludacris and DJ Quick, nice contrast. You didn't see this coming. No one asked for this outside of the industry, but as a consumer, it's like, oh, not bad. And truth be told, Luda kind of outshined on Virgo, and we'll break down his verse soon. All right. All these things are something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you're thinking about the features and whether they help the album or hurt the album. Takes us to Dimension 7, the question of, does the weakest song or do the weakest songs bring the album down? Okay. As always, most subjective dimension we have, that is totally up to you if you even believe there's a weak song on this album. 15 songs altogether on a 16-track album. If you're not a fan of those expected Ludacris songs, those songs that sound very Ludacris-y, then maybe those wind up being considered the weak ones to you. If some of those songs with the dated sounds just don't do it, those might be the ones. If you don't like some of those folk that are featured, if you don't like the singing, if you feel like the samples were too cheesy, you didn't want to hear a song that you associate with Austin Powers, or a song that sounds like something from a cartoon musical, or something that sounds like jungle animals in the background, then yeah, you might just be like, nah, this ain't it, dog. Or if you felt like some of the stuff was too on the nose, right? Like, I'm going to get a very East Coast sounding beat for DMX and a very West Coast sounding beat for DJ Quick, and it sounded like, yeah, too try hard. All those things are something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to Dimension 8, the mass appeal. Funny enough, you can find a video for Blueberry Yum Yum under the Mass Appeal channel on YouTube. So shout out to Nas. But for those of us who bought this album on CD when it first came out, I think I burned it. Sorry, Luda. The packaging came with a DVD of Ludacris's first trip to the red light district in Amsterdam and the show that he was doing, the film for the purposes of the DVD. He goes and visits a cannabis house. He visits a brothel. He visits like a digital cam model space and talks to the owner of that. And he shoots versions of videos for some of the songs on that DVD. Heads up for those of you who have not seen it, if you're looking for like full-scale videos, no, it's very handheld camera. I shot this for a DVD while I was on tour kind of thing, not like these angle things with real cuts and budgets. I actually think I remember the commercial for this album. Yeah, back then, when rap albums used to have real rollouts and commercials in between, like Rap City, and it looked more exciting than what he did over the intro for the DVD. But it was building this anticipation. You see Luda in front of the car, the Phantom, and he's rapping with his sunglasses on, and the ends were like, heads up, Ludacris is almost out of his deal. When you watch the number one spot video, which perfectly pays homage and gives you this black version of the Austin Powers movies all put into one video. It's like all three movies in one, with a lot of emphasis on the third installment, the Gold Member movie with Beyonce's character played by Lisa Ray, which props to Luda again, grabbing someone unexpected that seemed unattainable, not very easy to work with. You don't really see a lot of rappers doing work with Lisa Ray, or an actress of her caliber. At that point in time, she was still considered a name, a household name in that era. That's like getting Nia Long for a rap video. I think over the years, Lisa Ray has become more well known for her attitude and her persona than her acting. And at that time, he was able to get her in a video where she played a role that she perfectly fit, because Lisa Ray, I think, has a famous picture where she recreates the Ohio Players album cover, Drippin' Honey, and she looks like she was made for the role. She looks like she was genuinely having fun in the video. The video was meant to, impart a spirit of fun. Timing is the main ingredient there. Like I said, it's not too far removed from the wave and hype of that movie without being directly connected to that movie at all. That song winds up being the more recognized big single by the hip-hop community, because Get Back came first, but I think it got quickly embraced by pop culture, by the MTV crowd. The video is where it teeters a little too much to the silly territory, which I think became an Achilles heel for Ludacris. We've spoken about this in other episodes. It's iconic, it's memorable, it's like the Missy effect. But when you're remembered for making videos where you have big arms and you're, strangling people in the men's bathroom and just running around beating people up. Yeah, I think it was a Spike Jonze video too. So Spike Jonze is more associated with acts like Beastie Boys and Fatboy Slim. So it's like, okay, this is what you were going for. It works, because a few years later, it winds up getting used as the main outro song for the comedy Tropic Thunder, which is, a classic comedy film now. And it had a big number in it. It wasn't just like the rolling credit scene. It had a whole dance number that was recreated years after that, even at the MTV Movie Awards. So again, this is a big MTV crowd song. To this day, I think that is one of those rap songs that will get played commercial in more mainstream spaces, the way that Party Up by DMX gets played. Hip-hop crowd plays it in an obligatory fashion, but many other groups like that song, and they've adopted that song. Get Back is in that territory, whereas number one spot, I think we first realized, he's back out with a single. I also think Get Back was released really early on, before the album actually dropped. So number one spot came out closer to the actual release, and the video was on a making the video segment on BET, so you really got to see the behind the scenes. And then it splits with The Potion. And I don't know how many people got to that part, but The Potion, Ludacris is very creatively obvious, right? So I'm making Austin Powers references. I'm not going to give you this obscure video where I'm doing something else. I'm going to go full Austin Powers. The song's called The Potion. I'm going to be rapping in a lab. Sometimes you love that. It's not too simple, still enough. And that's a parallel to Ludacris's rap style. He's never going to get too intricate and lose you. He's from the Kanye West school of, I want to bring the audience with me. Not catch up if you can. Follow, meet me at the finish line. He's not that kind of rapper. Okay, so then you get to pimping all over the world. Same ideology at play here. I want to try to encapsulate access in one video and highlight the pieces of the verses that I'm talking about. But the overarching message of the video is, I am the first rapper on the mainstream level to shoot an entire rap video in South Africa. So they shoot it in Durban, South Africa, and they want to show you the beauty of a modern African country. So Ludacris has gone on record saying that he wanted to be a part of changing the narrative and making sure that his people are not still viewing Africa as mud huts in villages with half-dressed people. There are elements of that in every continent. There are tribal elements and more stripped down, rural, live off the land enclaves everywhere. But for centuries, this has been the dominant perception and image of Africa. He's like, no, let me show you the beauty. Let me show you beaches. Let me show you mansions. Let me show you big modern buildings and cities. And then more than anything else, let me show you beautiful people. Models of all shades with emphasis on darker skin models, because by this time, the complaint was loud about the hip hop standard and long practice of only featuring lighter skin models at the front. And, you know, to Luda's credit, the fact that he ends the song by making sure that he emphasizes this line, "We're the best at. Ain't no point in even asking, bruh. The best women all reside in Africa, and that's real." That takes it home that he really wants to put this imagery in your face blatantly. Now, you can imagine this is probably around the time where he either met or started talking to his now wife, Eudoxie, and his perception was changing. Again, a part of the maturation. He probably did a couple tour spots in different countries on the continent at that point and realized, oh, I knew nothing. I had no idea. And he wants to share that wisdom and realization. It's a growth from a song like Area Codes. It's part 2 to Area Codes, but a way more mature version. Area Codes, he's naming all these different domestic locations, all these poppin' cities in the United States, and naming them by phone numbers, and how he got a girl here and he has a girl here. This whole song is doing it on a global scale, naming countries and features and big events, everything from Howard Homecoming, shout out to Howard, you already know, HU, you know, all the way to Brazil and Caravana in Toronto. But he's just bigging up those things more than saying, yeah, I got a chick that does this and then that. Like, he's showing it. So Def Jam didn't really have to do a lot for him. He set up things, followed the successful blueprint that he laid out for himself. Even if the only 3 singles you remember are Get Back, #1 spot, and Pimpin' All Over the World, the job was done. They all got radio play. Even though Get Back went more in this direction, that just widens the Ludacris range and effect. From an executive standpoint, I'm just reaping the benefits. Do what you do. And it did what it did. It winds up going double platinum a year later. It quickly went gold, and it just continued the Ludacris legacy. He got nominated for a Grammy. I don't think it helped the Ludacris agenda that he was trying to go for, unless you were one of those people that actually listened to the album. From a single standpoint, it just seemed like more of the same. There's not a very big difference between the 3 singles from the 2 previous albums or the 3 previous albums and this one from a rollout standpoint. But if I'm cutting the checks, I'm like, you did it again. If I'm a fan, I'm like, nah, this is different. If I'm a casual listener, I'm like, oh, okay, another Luda joint. But something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 9. The 3 I's: impact, innovation, influence. All right, we just talked about that. Impact wise, it goes double platinum. This is a huge success. It's not anything new for Luda. All of his previous albums were touching platinum. This is still the era where rappers were dropping platinum. So 2 times is still a big deal because things were about to change with the downloadable, with the implementation of the iTunes store, and it still was this wave that he was riding. Now, he does have a line where he says, I went diamond with this album, and I get it. That's a part of Ludacris speaking words, the power of manifestation, the power of what you say, thoughts or things. But because it didn't live up to that anywhere near, it just seems like a big folly, or one of those lines that's like, oops. But it was still a big deal. I think this begins the quieting of Ludacris's reign over Atlanta, because there was like a 2-year span where he was the go-to Atlanta rapper, maybe 3 years. But once T.I. and Jeezy really rose to prominence and then Gucci Mane came out, this is all happening at this crossroads. This is the end of 2004. So essentially, this is a 2005 album. Jeezy's burning the mixtape circuit. Gucci's bubbling. T.I. is the new king of the South. And they have this beef, and, you know, Lil Flip has come out. All these different territories are now popping too. Houston rap is bigger than it has ever been on a mainstream level. And New Orleans with Cash Money, there really is some spreading out of the hip-hop landscape. The ringtone era is coming up. The West Coast is slowly trying to creep back up with a resurgence. And Luda's just standing firm, but I do think he's not the go-to after this point. So it's just another feather in the hat. Innovation-wise, Ludacris is ahead of his time with this DVD packaging. There's a lot of rappers doing it, but the content of that DVD was interesting. Luda is playing the interviewer. It's not just like this self-aggrandizing kind of DVD where it's like, yeah, come follow me, fans, come look at me. It's him going to these places and asking them questions that I think a lot of Americans would have asked at the time. And in hindsight, you see how genius it is, because this stuff looks so old now. Even the digital chat camera girl culture that they were highlighting there seems so crazy, and now it's the norm. It's the precursor to OnlyFans. They were doing in Amsterdam in 2004. The cannabis shops, now that legalization, there's a point in that DVD where one of the shop owners is saying, we're the only country where this is legalized and other countries should follow suit. We don't have these drug problems. We don't have these crime problems. And, you know, now most of the world has legalized marijuana, and this stuff is just, there's a whole generation who grew up only knowing that you can go to the store and go to the cannabis club and do this. But that was such a focal point of that DVD. Like, oh, what if this ever happens? And let me see this and look at all of this. And, you know, if you're into that culture, it takes you back in time to what the hip hop outlook was on these things. But just being able to give that level of content, not just filler stuff. That's about it. As far as influence, again, I think this is an album that kind of gets overshadowed by the rest of Luda's catalog, because some of the hits from the earlier albums were bigger, and then the recognition of the albums that came after kind of trumps this. But I do think it winds up being the perfect middle album and probably the most special album of his career. But that's something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to the final dimension, dimension 10, the overall uniqueness and timelessness of this album. Where does this album fit in the conversation of classic hip-hop albums in general? Does it even deserve to be here? We talked about it having some dated beats. We talked about it having some expected moments. We also talked about, from a singles and casual listener standpoint, this seeming like a very formulaic, run-of-the-mill Ludacris rollout. But then we also talked about some super special things he did on visual media with DVD and his videos, with some of the collaborations, and a lot with the production. And I think that warrants a closer look for those of you that may have heard this album and really didn't pay attention to those highlights. And for those who were listening to it the first time, I'd suggest listening to this as an audio body of work first, without the videos and without anything else, and then adding that stuff in and seeing if you can pick up on anything. And also, if you read the lyrics while you listen to it, it might take you to a different space. And that would take us into the next category when we go into it and really break down the rap aspect of who Ludacris is. For now, all of these things are something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you're thinking about the overall timelessness and uniqueness of this album, which we are now concluding, the now 20-year-old Red Light District by Ludacris. Join us for the next video. And until then, y'all know what it is. F a rap critic. They talk about it while I live it. Word to meth.